Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining our panel discussion with members of Sexta Grietas del Norte on the state of U.S. politics after the elections. My name is Targol Mesbah. I'm an educator living in Oakland, California, a member of Grietas, and I'll be facilitating our conversation today about how we can continue organizing our collective struggle for liberation. Today's webinar will be in English. Spanish translation will be available on our YouTube channel within the next day or two. I'll be posing questions to our panelists and inviting each participant to respond. We will also be taking questions from the audience. So if you're watching this webinar live, please write in your questions in the comment section of YouTube or Facebook. Sexta Grietas del Norte is a network of autonomous organizations and individuals of resistances and rebellions that builds collective self-organization and anti-capitalist struggle against the hierarchical structures of state power and the capitalist civilization of death. Our name, Sexta, which is Spanish for sixth, refers to the Sixth Declaration of the Zapatistas in 2006. Grietas is Spanish for cracks and refers to breaking down the walls that divide us in order to conquer and control us. From the United States, we fight to tear down those walls. Our network was formed in response to the Isa de Len campaign, the walls of capital, the cracks of the left. At that meeting, we promised to bring Zapatista coffee to the north of the wall to help migrant and refugee relatives. From there, our collective organization was born, and the need to create a more concrete network in struggle and accompaniment with the Campas of the Isa de Len and CNI SIG were formed. We're committed to the fight for the defense and the formation of a dignified life, which includes resisting the oppressive racial and patriarchal hierarchies and acting outside the established system of political parties. Our objectives are to mutually support our struggles and solidarity with our compañeros from the Zapatista Army of National Liberation and the National Indigenous Congress, the Indigenous Governing Council, and the Six in Mexico and everywhere. We want to build a broad front of autonomous and community struggles in the United States. We join all the people who struggle to create and preserve dignified and sustainable ways of life, especially the indigenous peoples who struggle to preserve their lives, history, identity, their ancestral lands, and to protect Mother Earth. We're all adherents to the Sixth Declaration and agree with the 7 organizational principles of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. To obey, not to command. I'm going to read briefly the 7 principios. To obey, not command. To represent, not supplant. To serve others, not serve oneself. To convince, not defeat. To work from below, not go above. To propose, not impose. To build, not destroy. So today, we're not offering a single representative position or perspective. This is a conversation between different voices and members of Sexta Grietas del Norte from their different geographies within the United States. So for my first question, I'm first going to invite each participant to introduce yourself and, if applicable, your collective. And for you to tell us where you're located and why you are a member of Sexta Grietas del Norte, and if you'd like, what you can elaborate on what the sixth means to you. So I would like to begin with inviting Daisy to join us and introduce herself.
Saludos, compas. Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daisy Bugarin. I am part of a collective called Semillas Collective in New York City, Lenape land, Sexta Grietas del Norte member. And there's many reasons why I am a part of Sexta Grietas, but I would say that through this national network, we really get to practice the principios, the principles that Targol just shared, and really learn what it means to work in collective and unite our struggle from coast to coast, literally. And it's really amazing to be part of a network that's committed to imagining a new world and knowing that it's possible, and seeing the CNI and the ECLN as an example of what this new world can look like and how we can grow autonomy no matter where we are. So thank you, Targol.
Thank you, Daisy. Ari, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Aria Maya, and I'm from Nayarit, Mexico. And I'm here representing the Eagle and Condor Liberation Front, which is an autonomous indigenous organization based in Los Angeles, Tongvaland. And ECLF is based off the Quichua Andean prayer of the Eagle and the Condor. And, you know, that prayer is also why we're part of the Sexta Grietas. It's, you know, unifying indigenous communities from North America, Canada, Alaska, the Pacific Islands, all the way down to South America. And so that's why I think ECLF is really integrated into the Sexta Grietas, and we really believe in all of those principles and the principles that Targol mentioned, you know, that guides our collective as well.
Thank you, Ari. Silvia, will you please join us and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Silvia Garcia. I am in New York City. I am part of Semillas. I'm part of running for Ayotzinapa 43. Both collectives, you know, they're trying to wake up, you know, the conscience of the people in a different ways. Semillas by the art and, you know, a lot of hard work, and running for Ayotzinapa 43 by the sport and the unity as a family with not only Mexican people, but with a lot of other, you know, sisters and brothers from all Latin America and even from all the world. As being part of the Sexta is very important, as you know, as a grieta, like the Spanish people, and the Spanish word means, you know, grieta, like you could go beyond everything, you know, you could be as, you know, like a part of the conscience of the people, like a little grieta in your heart, in your soul, and even, you know, in the energy of the world, and you could make a big change. That's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you for your beautiful world, Silvia. Roberto, can you please join us and introduce yourself?
Nanotoka Roberto Hernandez, Masewali, Autonomía Xochitequio, Nanansin, Wirarikatlali, Tatatsin, Mamtlali, Hauka, Ewa, Mat Kumiai. Good evening, everyone. I'm Roberto Hernandez. I am a member of the collective Autonomía Xochitequio, which is an outgrowth and expansion of a previous incarnation of Hormigas Autónomas y Rebeldes. I come from territories on my mother's side with Wirarica territories and Mom territories on my father's side. And I bring you greetings from Mat Kumiai, or Kumiai land here, otherwise known as San Diego Tijuana border. And yeah, I would just say that in terms of both my own and Autonomía Xochitequio and Hormigas before us involvement with Grietas, we began as part of the process of bringing the coffee hormiga style across this border a couple years back, and have carried forward with the work in terms of supporting the compas of the CNI CIG with the coffee, but then also with the HIRA in the U.S. and a few different invites and visitations from them, and just continuing to work in support of them, and at the same time working to build our own autonomías here in our context, in the Centro Cultural de la Raza, for example, where I'm located now. But in terms of the work with the CNI and CIG, especially in the context of AMLO y la Cuarta Transformación, the current president, and that was supposed to be a president, supposedly more amicable to indigenous communities, but we've seen that that's not the case. So we continue to support not only the work happening in Mexico, but also serving as a bridge of sorts with between pueblos originarios in Mexico in the south with indigenous communities, First Nations here in the north.
Thank you, Roberto. Last but not least, Kiki, please join us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Kirish, but please do call me Kiki. I am the daughter of undocumented migrants here in Southern California in Oxnard and granddaughter of the Maya Mon people who've sadly been cut by the border of Mexico and Guatemala. I am a popular educator here in my community of Oxnard, which is on Chumash land. And I do a lot of educational work in public parks, in living rooms, and on a little farm that I work on. I also am a writer and a translator. I translate between Spanish and English, a lot of the political theory coming out of Latin America into English and then vice versa. And I do a lot of work on the Middle East as well as on Latin America, in particular with the Palestinian movement and with the Zapatista struggle. And I'm currently writing a book that's putting the Palestinian struggle into conversation with indigenous resistance here on this hemisphere, along with the Black radical tradition as well. I am a member of Sexta Grietas del Norte because the Sixth Declaration is something that really touched me, and having done a lot of work here in the United States, in Palestine, and in Latin America, and seeing that it was really difficult to change the world. And so it really resonated with me when the Zapatistas said, maybe it's impossible to change the world, so why don't we just create another one where many worlds fit? And that to me is the power of the Sixth Declaration. And so being part of Sexta Grietas del Norte here in the US, it allows me to find so many of us who have a similar desire, and also to share the word of the movements down south, because I think that they have really great analyses that we can really use here in the US, not so much to model, but to at least show us that we don't really need to use our imaginations to see how the creation of another world would look, because it's already happening. So that's why I'm a member of Sexta Grietas del Norte.
Thank you, Kiki, and thank you, everybody. So I'll move into our second question, which is a two-part question. So in the past 2 years, and especially in recent months, mass movements against police brutality, systemic racism, and the rise of authoritarianism intensified a new energy against Trump, or perhaps even against the dominant political system as a whole. This has been one of the most powerful experiences of popular critical education a whole generation is participating in by protesting in the streets and organizing and engaging in direct action, as we have seen with Black Lives Matter, for example. In this context, questions about tactics are everywhere. And we can see at least 3 trends in the existing political system in the US, not necessarily, or not perspectives that we share, but that these are the 3 trends that, at least 3 that we can discern at the moment. And this is just a way for us to begin this conversation. So first, some argue for infiltrating the Democratic Party to move it to the left, overthrowing its neoliberal leadership and replacing it by progressive or even socialist perspective, for example, supporting folks like Bernie Sanders. Second, some advocate for building a third progressive and grassroots party, since the Democratic Party is essentially controlled by the capitalist elite and most are frustrated with both institutional parties. And third, others see rebellion rather than voting as the best tactic to move the US in a more progressive and anti-capitalist direction. And change will happen rather in the streets rather than in the polling places. So the first part of this question is, what do you each, as members of Sexta, with the Zapatista perspective, think about these trends? And the second part of the question, I will provide a bit of context for. So in 2005, when the Sixth Declaration explicitly expressed its departure from electoral politics of the nation state and instead foregrounded the struggle against capitalism. And in 2017, the Zapatistas and the CNI put forth the Indigenous Governing Council with Marichui as the first Indigenous woman to run as a candidate for the 2018 presidential elections in Mexico. So it's important to note that this was not a reversal of the Israelen's position in the Sixth, as Marichui was never expected to win the elections. So it wasn't really about entering electoral politics. But instead, it was a strategic move to organize and connect with different autonomous communities in Mexico. So the second part of this question then is, how do you see a strategic or tactical engagement in electoral politics in the US today? And let us begin with Ari.
Yeah, so as ECLF, some of the strategies that we've been using, amidst this election and beyond that, like for the past 4 years that we've been organizing, a lot of it has been centered around autonomy. So being a sovereign collection beyond having a dependency on the nation state. So a lot of what we work on is mutual aid, which we've been seeing a lot recently with this, the current like Black Lives Matter movement, like Dargol mentioned. So that's kind of what we try to center it. It's more moving beyond what is currently there and making sure that us as a community within our respective communities, we help each other, so that is a lot of work revolving around food sovereignty, where we are trying to build our own seed libraries, having sovereignty over our food, who grows it, who it's distributed to. And then obviously that's directly connected to having that land sovereignty. And basically what we're trying to do is have a dependency on each other, on our communities, instead of having to depend on the nation state. And obviously we're constantly working against it, but more than that, we're working as a collective to build our communities, making sure that they understand that the power is within our communities already. We don't need anybody to justify our power. We have the means, we have the knowledge that, that goes back thousands of years with our antepasados, our grandparents know how to grow their own food and all of that. So I think that's really what we try to focus it on. We try to build community beyond already. It's already possible within this current democracy. So I think that's kind of one of our strategies that we really try to do, and that's kind of the take that we use currently, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Ari. Kiki, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, thank you. I really like the question of strategy and tactics when it comes to electoral politics. And I really wish that in the United States, that was more part of the conversation. There are a few folks who do speak in that way, but from what I've seen from those three trends that you pointed to, Targol, is that there isn't very much of an engagement in terms of strategy. That is that, like, if we understand strategy, the way that, like, for example, Che Guevara lays out in guerrilla warfare, where strategy is your main program of how you're going to reach your goal. And if your goal is freedom, what is going to be that main program? The great example in our context is the Zapatistas. They've decided just to create their own government, their own clinics, their own schools. A tactic is then just a tool, a method that you can dispose of very, very easily if it's not making you stronger the next day. If it's making you weaker the next day, then absolutely dispose of it. But if it can make you stronger, then that can be really helpful. And with the Zapatistas, again, there is international law. It's an old example from the 1990s. And I wrote a little essay about this for the Palestinian movement, because they have this similar question with the United Nations. Should they use the United Nations, even though it was the United Nations that created the problem of Israel-Palestine? And we can link to that essay if anyone's interested, because it outlines more about how the Zapatistas maneuver strategy and tactics. And that essay is called Palestine, the Zapatistas, and the Global Exercises of Power. And we can put that in the notes if anyone's interested. I don't see too much of that in the United States, like this engagement of let's move the Democratic Party to the left, or let's create a third party, or direct action on the streets. Although I don't see people talking about those as tactical engagements. I can read that they're tactical engagements. But if there isn't a strategy that accompanies it, then what's going to happen, and is what is happening, is that all of that power that's generated from this kind of opposition is just going to get co-opted into the dominant strategy, which is the strategy of capital and colonialism. And so very, very concretely, with Bernie, for example, someone, Diallo Kenyatta, who's a Pan-Africanist, he's someone who does understand this distinction quite well. And what he says about voting, what he said about voting in this last election was, yes, we do need to overthrow this empire. We're going to have to do it anyway. I'd rather do it with Medicare for all, which is what Bernie Sanders that's what was on his platform. That's what he was offering, an actual policy. And so then that's an engagement. Like, is having someone like Bernie Sanders going to make things easier for us, or going to make things harder for us? In my case, in my analysis, I thought that voting for Bernie Sanders, and it was actually pretty important that Bernie Sanders win the primary, which he did not, because the Democratic Party destroyed him. And the reason why I thought that tactically him winning is because he was speaking to the more populist from below base, which is what Trump is doing. And he could neutralize a lot of the people that go toward Trump with that populist, more economic talk about everyday life struggles, concrete struggles that people face. This was the Trump appeal in 2016. It was the Bernie appeal in 2016, and it continued to be the Bernie appeal in 2020. And so for those of us who are in struggle for something much bigger, for the creation of this other world where many worlds fit, rather than the perpetuation of the dominant system, we are going to have this fight. We are having these fights right now on the street in this country. It's been going on for centuries, especially for Black and people of color, Indigenous people. If we can have it be a little bit easier by having less of that militancy on the street, that's the more right-wing, very xenophobic, explicitly fascist type, that would have been great. But we lost that because we didn't get a Bernie Sanders type of person talking about the issues that affect people's everyday life. Rather, we got Biden, who is, he's very much emblematic of like the empire that has been flailing since decolonization of the last century, that needs a person of color, that needs a Black person, that needs the wretched of the earth to in its camp to show that it's a more benevolent type. And so Biden, the only reason why the world knows about Biden is because of a Black man, Barack Obama. And the only reason why Biden even won the presidency is because of Barack Obama and because of a Black woman, Kamala Harris. And so that I think doing this kind of or engaging in electoral politics in this way, where it's either Trump or Biden. In terms of strategy and tactics, I'm not really sure, like for the long run, what it's going to mean. But I do think that it's going to be up to us to make sure that what happens is that with Biden, people don't go back to sleep how they were under Obama, and that there's more resistance and opposition with Biden, which at least can be possible for that moment with the Trump distraction out of the way. But then there is no guarantee that there's going to be a Trump distraction out of the way, because Trump himself isn't about Trump. It's about this massive militancy, xenophobic militancy that's responding to a structural change in capital that we can talk about a little bit later. But I'll leave it at that because I think I've gone quite long.
Thank you so much, Kiki. And to your point about this, the importance of articulating strategies and tactics, because they're so infinitely co-optable by empire. You know, in Oakland, when the protests were first started a few months ago, the Oakland Police Department was using the language of mutual aid, like literally saying, you know, mutual aid, to refer to police from other cities coming to assist Oakland Police Department. So yeah, even our most beloved practices can be co-opted into another service if we're not clear about what the longer strategies and goals are. So let's move on to Roberto.
Hey, so I'm assuming same question, right? And I guess I would approach this a little bit differently, in that for me, the question of tactics itself and related to strategy, right? Because they're not mutually exclusive, but they're not unlike questions of method. And what I mean by that is that whenever we try to analyze or study something, we oftentimes ask, well, how are you going to study that, right? And the very way in which we choose to approach it already determines the types of answers we're going to get. And so sometimes when we're thinking about tactics, right, we want to find the perfect tactic. What tactic will get us to revolution within the fold of a broader strategy? But there's this idea that somehow, if we only study it in advance and get it right through a proper method of revolution, if you will, that we will arrive at that stated goal, right? And so part of the problem there, when we think mechanically in this way of either infiltrating the party or advocating a third party or rebellion as if they're mutually exclusive, or even if not mutually exclusive, but only through these already three predetermined routes, we also run the risk of becoming a bit mechanical. And so for me then, to paraphrase Frantz Fanon, when he talks about the question of method, I would think about that also in relation to the question of tactics. And Fanon says, you know, and he's talking here more about the psychology of colonization, but he's talking about the need to start with a methodological point of view, or in this case, a tactical point of view. And instead, and here I quote, "I leave methods to the botanists and the mathematicians. There's a point at which methods or tactics devour themselves. I should like to start from there. I should try to discover the various attitudes," and now here I'm kind of shifting from Fanon, "in which we or the pueblos adopt in contact with white civilization." And that is to say that, as the Zapatistas have showed us, there is instead another avenue, which is that of caminando preguntando, or walking while asking questions, right? That all these tactical decisions, and I think here, you know, although we arrive at it in a different way, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Kiki, but that these tactical decisions are decisions that are arrived at through the walking, in the process of walking. There's no one right answer from the get-go, but we're only going to be able to arrive at it through walking, through the actual doing of politics. And this is where I think the Sexta Declaration, in part, you know, shifting, if you will, towards the second part of the question, I would say that the Sexta didn't so much mark a departure from an electoral politics. I think that I disagree with that framing, but rather a rendering it irrelevant, which is different than departure. It's still there. It's not going away. And so the Sexta said, voten o no voten, vamos por una política otra. Whether you vote or not, we're in it for a different type of politics, right? Politics from below and to the left. But it doesn't negate the fact that the state is still there, and not only is it still there, it's actively shooting at you. So what are you going to do, right? And so it's in that instance where more than anything, we need to develop a proper conceptual clarity and political literacy to understand the moment, to understand the various different avenues that can be taken. And as some of our compas in Chile have pointed to, even a year, 2 years in advance of this recent victory, for a new constitution, right? They're using the state, but there's some compas in Chile who talk about organizing sin y contra el Estado, with, without, and against the state, which is to say that all avenues are open, and it's in walking while asking that we determine, with that ultimate strategy or goal in mind of how do we develop autonomía de los pueblos, we walk in a way that engages all tactical avenues available to us, be they rebellion, be they otherwise. And all that is only possible if you have the political literacy and the conceptual clarity to know when to even bother with the state, when not to bother with the state, because again, it's still there, it's not going away. So at some level, there has to be a certain type of engagement. So this is where I think the Sexta wasn't so much a departure and then Marichui, a re-engagement or with the state. It was just choosing to go through that avenue, as you rightly stated in your question, as one of many tactics towards política otra, a politics from below and to the left. So I'm not, decided on any one tactic, right? I think is we need to understand all of them. I mean, here in San Diego, in North County, San Diego, some of our compas in North County, from Maíz, Universidad Popular, and other orgs that have been gerentes and members previously of Grietas, just recently swept a whole campaign. They took over locally a school board. They took over a supervisor position for some regional board of some sort, right? So even by their own account, they don't really care per se about the electoral politics, but it was an avenue that opened up, and now they're inhabiting it to do what they've always been doing, which is organizing from below and to the left. So I mean, in closing, I would just say we need not foreclose any and all avenues if we have that conceptual clarity and that political literacy in mind that will help us read the camino and know which way to go.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And I think that what you're saying also speaks to the focus on an anti-capitalist analysis that the compas have been asking us to do, as Kiki reminds us all the time, that the Zapatistas want us to produce our own critiques and our analyses of capitalism, the capitalist hydra, in our own geographies. And you're absolutely right, which includes developing our own literacies and also continuing with walking while asking questions. So thank you for that, Roberto. And let's move on to Daisy.
Sure, yes. Agree with both perspectives that Kiki and Roberto just offered. Frantz Fanon also said, world with language, empowered by act. Marichui makes a lot of mention of this, that the word not only carries life, but that it has to be supported by actions. And I think that the ECLN and the CNI, especially the campaign, Marichu's campaign, teaches us is that primero es el camino, as Roberto is, and knowing that within our communities, we can work as a collective and have a very clear vision if we are thinking about tactics, if you want to call it that, when we think about infiltrating the electoral system or the Democrat Party, as the question was mentioned. But it's about going beyond that. I mean, we have not only seen Marichu's campaign, we can look at Aida Quilcue from the Consejo Regional Indígena de Gobierno, the CRIC in Colombia, indigenous autonomous, another indigenous autonomous example, committed to decolonizing politics. And Aida also went into the electoral political race to visibilize el mal gobierno, not just targeting one political party, but the system in itself, the way that Marichu did, and the way that we are seeing now with the recent announcement of Francia Marquez, a Colombiana, who plans to run for the presidency. It's very clear that the intention is to really give voice to los de abajo, to amplify the voice of the pueblos, and to really, without any censorship or the political language that we hear that just goes around in circles without really talking about the root cause of everything, which is capitalism, which are mega projects, which is, and it looks differently in different geographies, which it could be gentrification, as we see in New York. They were able to confront these issues and hold the state accountable. And I think that that is important. I know that Semillas were really committed to thinking about different decolonizing strategies and practices and what it means to think about decolonizing politics in general. But I think that we have a lot to learn from these campaigns and how strategic they were, again, to amplify the voices of the pueblos and to make it inclusive. So for us to ask ourselves in the US, what would this truly look like? Because even in these socialist movements like the Sanders camps, there's a lot of POC, indigenous folks who don't identify, who don't feel comfortable in that space, who end up often feeling like the token Mexican or the token POC person in that progressive leftist space, right? So in the case of Mexico, we even see what we might see in the future with a Sanders camp when we look at AMLO, which is a fake progressive left government that is doing nothing to really confront these mega projects of death, and we see increased militarization and all these things that plague our communities all over the world. And as far as like part B of the question, I think that, so rather than thinking about building a third, I don't even like to use the word progressive grassroots party, is to, again, decolonize the language. And we can learn so much just from reading the ECLN palabra, right? The comunicados, the CNI palabra. They're speaking a different language. It's a different cosmovisión, right? And within that, there's evidently a very strong connection to Mother Earth, la Madre Tierra, the land. And I think that it's a good time for us to maybe reflect on that. How do we relate to the land that we are on? And when we think of what we want in the future, or más bien what we don't want, we really need to steer away from what has been done before and go beyond thinking about, like I said, targeting a political party or convincing someone or leaning them towards the left. That's not necessary. And we see the example with the ECLN by moving in collective and not sugarcoating la lucha por la vida and the civilization of death that we are in. It actually becomes quite simple. You're either for life or for death, right? And so as a doctor or in public health, it's like you're either for la vida o la muerta. There are systems that are set into place that support racist eugenics, like we see in the US, that right now with COVID, right, in New York especially, it is no surprise that nuestros knows, our families, our friends who died of COVID were mostly POC. And there's other systems that are for life. And we are seeing that it's tangible, it's possible through autonomía. That's the common factor, through autonomy. And so thinking about what that can look like as we see how the ECLN is organized through its different caracoles, and thinking about land bases and what it means for us to start to decolonize our own practices, our relation to the land, and really become stronger as a collective within our neighborhoods and within our community. I think that it's really important to get to that point first, before we get to a point of infiltrating or implementing any kind of tactic like that. But I do think it's possible, and I think that we have amazing examples when we look at Marichui, indigenous woman, Aida Quirquen, and another indigenous woman, and hopefully we'll see Francia move forward with her campaign as well. It's this amazing thing to not only in respect to thinking about decolonizing politics, but also confronting patriarchy.
Thank you so much, Daisy. And last but not least, Silvia, if you could join us, please.
Thank you. I agree with the majority of, Daisy and Roberto and Ori. Like, I think that we are not ready for rebellion, but I believe that that could be the best way. But not only as a crazy rebellion, we don't have yet, all of us, the enough conscience to take the next step. So we need to build that conscience. But at least we are resisting, all the changes that they are in the world. And I believe that we don't need to believe in saints or miracles or people who are participating in a party, like specifically, for example, of AMLO or whoever it is there, because the change is not in them. The change is in all of us. So we are trying to make this conscience and, to get nuestras raíces, like, our roots. Sometimes we forgot. We are so busy that we forgot that we need to take care of the root. If we have a strong roots, we're going to last forever, and we're going to resist, and we're going to build something else. We are, in a time of evolution. I don't believe in the, in the progressive word. Also, it looks like, for me, like the word solidaridad, and in the past, the pre-party in Mexico, they used to use very often. And, they don't even know what it means. So we are not in the progressive time of politics. We need to, we need to remember that we come from Mother Earth. And as the Mother Earth, we need to make the evolution to happen. And only by conscience, we are going to get the point of view like we do now for the pandemic situation, that la lucha por la vida, all that you do to be alive is only the essentials. You don't need a lot of things. You don't need basically politics also. But you need to find what is your lucha por la vida. What are you looking for? And when you make that in real solidarity, but you are my sister or my brother, and we are working together to be in a better state, then we are talking, we are evolutioning. And as the autonomy that we have in our collectives, that's the autonomy that we are trying to grow in every person and every for example, every runner talking about the running for Ayotzinapa 43 or in Semillas, every people that we touch with all that we do is trying to be autonomy, resistance, and, get a conscience by the evolution that we are now. So I don't believe in politics at all, but I believe in a man. I believe in you, and I believe in me. So we don't forget that. Otherwise, we are doing nothing.
Thank you, Silvia. And you have anticipated my next question a little bit. So, and actually all of you, your responses may have already touched on this point, but can you address more explicitly or elaborate on how you see movements beyond this election and electoral politics in general that can confront the civilization of death? We've already touched on the language of autonomy and different practices of that Ari spoke to around movements to grow food and cooperative movements, but perhaps this can be a time for us to elaborate more explicitly on the different approaches and practices and projects that people are engaged in right now or are planning for in the future. So we'll begin with Ari again. You're on mute, Ari.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so like everybody spoke about, there are different tactics and everything. And, a lot of it doesn't really apply to every single person. So even if one president were to be elected, certain people will always be left out. And that's just how it was created, right? It wasn't meant to serve Indigenous, Black, refugees, like no one, right? So that's why I think we really focus on working towards that liberation, not only through combating it, but like I had mentioned before, actively getting to know our communities, reaching out to different communities. So as ECLF, we've tried to connect with communities from like South America, here in the United States. And I think that's really how it begins. It just begins, even moving beyond just academia and, if everybody has something to share, and so making that education accessible, sharing ideas and everything, I think that's really what autonomy means. And so I think with the food sovereignty and land sovereignty and everything that we work towards, it's really just about getting to know your neighbors, getting to know who you can help, how you can help them. And that's kind of what, we've been trying to get towards. But I don't know. I feel like I'm still kind of trying to process what everybody has said. So maybe I can add on a little bit later too.
Thank you so much, Ari. Kiki, would you like to respond to the question, please?
Yeah, I think it's like Ari said, it's going to be very contextual because we have so many differences around us, and which is great, especially in a civilization, a society that wants to annihilate difference or absorb difference. When it comes to this question of the civilization of death, and I can speak about our context here in Southern California, and it's not just specific to us, is this question of climate change. The logical conclusion of the civilization of death is extinction. And we're living through the 6th great mass extinction on planet Earth. And that's something that sadly, electoral politics in the United States has very little to say about right now. And even a Biden administration, might get back onto the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords themselves only try to mitigate a little bit of the future to continue capital going. which it makes so true, that statement, that sentiment that says we can imagine the end of the world first before we can even imagine the end of capital. And then that's, to me, a central issue there when it comes to what our movements, I think what our responsibility is as beings on this planet, is to focus, to understand that this is not a human problem, climate change. It is a systemic problem. It's a very specific problem of capital. Humans have been around for 200,000 years as Homo sapiens, but CO2 emissions have only been exceeding or rising in the way that they have over the last 150 years with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels for energy. So in our context, when it comes to climate change here in Southern California, we live on the coast. Looking at sea level rise maps, our hometowns are going to be underwater, likely in our lifetime. But that's not something that we don't think about it. Well, is it going to happen in my lifetime? Because if not, then that's fine. We don't understand our lifetime as ending the moment that we die. We understand ourselves as continuing to exist on for generations and generations as a collective of all beings on life. We also have wildfires in California, as we've seen, massive, massive drought. We're going to have extreme weather, massive climate refugees, more border walls being built to keep folks out. And sadly, the elections had almost nothing to say about this beyond those supporting Bernie Sanders, which are far more radical than he himself was. He himself is still very much establishment and not anti-capitalist. He may be critical of corporations, but not anti-capitalist in the sense that needs to happen. And so then if the question of the civilization of death and capitalist logic of destroying everything, of killing everything in order to accumulate profit or power, if that's actually the issue, and I'm not imposing that as an analysis, but it is our analysis here, then the question that we have before us, especially those of us who have been pushed off the land or kidnapped from our lands, is and moved into urban centers, and urban centers are highly, highly dependent on capital processes as they extract from the countryside and bring resources over into the urban areas. A big question for us is how many of us know how to live without capital? And so then that becomes a question for building autonomy. How can we build autonomy? How can we figure out how to even eat, how to have clean water, how to have housing, how to have community, security, love, art, all of those beautiful things that make the world? How can we do that? And that's something that we're trying to figure out here in our context by figuring out how it is that in the absence of having access to land, how can we train for it while we're in an urban context? And beyond that, like the question of, and how are we going to survive together? How are we not going to replicate what we've been seeing over the last 500 years throughout the world, that those of us who are persecuted or oppressed or exploited, what empire offers us is a way to continue to survive as long as we bring down other folks. How can we not replicate that is going to be the big question, I think, because if we don't address that in moving forward, I think that what's going to happen is just a massive extreme of what we have already been living over the last 500 years, just on a global scale, which is already a global scale, but at this wild extreme that is going to be really difficult to maneuver. And so this is, I think, the question for our times: the defense of life, la lucha por la vida, the defense of Mother Earth, and how are we going to continue surviving, but surviving together? And again, if the problem is capital, how are we going to learn how to live without capital?
Thank you, Kiki. Roberto, would you please respond to the question?
If I remember it correctly, I think in terms of what other ways we've talked about confronting the civilization of death, one of the ways that I myself and others, not just me, conceive of the civilization of death is also in terms of what we call modernity coloniality. And, in some of the work, I do the work here with Autonomía Xochitecyo, but I also happen to be academic, and one of the ways we talk about it, or I talk about it, is this idea of a epistemic and cartographic prison of modernity coloniality. And what I mean by that is that part of the ways in which civilization of death has constrained and privileged certain ways of knowing while constraining others is that we value Western knowledge. Everything we talk about is Eurocentrism and so on. We value Western knowledge and ways of being and knowing as opposed to other ways in this world. But what I mean by a cartographic prison of modernity coloniality is that part of what has happened in actually existing civilization of death, if you will, is that through the division of the globe into nation-state units, right, through the creation of nation-state borders, we also find it very difficult to articulate ourselves in ways other than what nation-state borders dictate, right? So we come to know the world as Mexicanos, Canadians, Guatemalans, right? One of the primary forms of identifications tends to be national identities, right? And we don't move out of that. And so I wanted to begin by that because I think part of challenging the civilization of death is also undoing the ways of knowing that limit the ways in which we conceive of ourselves. So we don't think of ourselves as pueblos, whether we be officially recognized pueblos, detribalized, deterritorialized pueblos, but we don't think of ourselves as pueblos in the ways that I think we should, right? And that one of the many lessons that the CNI, the CIG, Zapatistas, and others have reminded us to recognize that we are all the pueblo, and knowing where our pueblos matters, or even, creating our own sense of pueblos amongst the territorialized matters. Because to the extent that we only lock ourselves into these nation states and national identities, we also create all kinds of other problems. So, for example, back in the 1970s, Huey P. Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, started talking about intercommunalism. And in his work on intercommunalism, you could see early attempts to try to move away from nation-state thinking to thinking about relations across pueblos. And so for me, in engaging with former Panthers, one of them once told us, when Huey started talking about intercommunalism, we had no idea what the hell he was talking about. It made no sense. But now in retrospect, looking at both Huey's intercommunalism, looking at the Zapatistas, looking at the notion of, the time of the flowering of the pueblos has arrived, that the CNI has also made one of its lemmas, its slogans, the time of the flowering of the pueblos. We see that there is ample space to think about this intercommunal conversation, learning from the various geographies. But this is where I would bring in one more, which we don't usually put in conversation, and that is some of the lessons and advances that have been made in Venezuela in particular, but also places like Bolivia and Ecuador and other places in Latin America. But Venezuela in particular is important because one of the things, and it goes back to what I raised earlier about political literacy, and that is a question of what the hell is even going on in Venezuela. And if we only read politics through the idea of the state or no state, communism, socialism, or capitalism, even communism, socialism versus anarchism, it becomes easy to be dismissive of what's playing out in and through that state. But what is playing out there, and in particular, I'd invite people to reference what's called the Golpe de Timón, a document that was made by Hugo Chavez before his passing, where he articulates or spells out what he in Venezuela is spoken of as a poder comunal, communal power. Now, the problem with poder comunal is that they're all still thinking of themselves as Venezuelans, national identity through national territorial borders, and not as the many diverse pueblos that constitute the territory now called Venezuela. That is something that I've been trying to be in conversation with Venezuelans about. But if we were to look to this notion of poder comunal as it's being articulated in Venezuela, which in many ways is the institutionalization of the Bolshevik communes, if you will, and this is where we make the hero from communism of the 20th century to the 21st century and learn the lessons, but it's definitely a departure. What might it look like to put in conversation el poder comunal with autonomía as articulated by Zapatistas, with intercommunalism as articulated by Huey? And I think there's a very fruitful ground there that even those of us that have a tendency to lean more towards Zapatismo are sometimes hesitant to even look to places where there's politics playing out through the state, as in Venezuela and Bolivia. So I think we need to also not be so formulaic, as I was saying earlier, and tactically open ourselves to an engagement with el golpe de timón, el poder comunal, and see what that conversation with Zapatismo can do for us. Because I think in that convergence of the two, there is much to do in terms of the advocating of life, in terms of the advocating of el caminar de los pueblos, not el pueblo venezolano, right, which is, again, argument I'm having with some of them folks, but el caminar de todos los pueblos en su conjunto, including los múltiples pueblos que constituyen el pueblo venezolano. So that's also part of the undoing of that cartographic person, right, of no longer thinking of ourselves in and through only national identities that at the end of the day limit and constrain how we're even able to imagine another world that is already actually existing.
Thank you, Roberto. Daisy, would you like to join the conversation?
The compas just mentioned. To answer this question in regards as to how, or giving some examples of how we feel in New York, at least to work with Semillas, how we're confronting the civilization of death, again, goes back to going beyond political theory and terminology and all of that, which we find in these times, these really intense political times. But we decided to do, for example, in regards to the increased fascism because of the Trump administration, specifically targeting migrant communities and families, we looked at the Zapatista model again, and we noticed how they always managed to be more creative than the oppressor. So what we've been doing with addressing sort of like what it means to have political awareness or the decolonization of political education, which in reality lacks in the US. Cuba says that the US is too dumb to understand democracy, let alone can they really understand, or Americans understand, socialism. And unfortunately, it's true that there's a lot of political consciousness missing, especially in youth and in our community. So what Semillas has been doing is we've been incorporating political education, as in presenting the Zapatista model and the CNI principles, creative art projects. Our last film, Papalot Muyus, is in solidarity to families that are detained in concentration camps, really, ICE camps. But beyond it being a solidarity protest dance film, we talked about decolonization, and the children tap into their indigenous roots and coming out in their indigenous atuendos. It was all very strategic, but again, we were looking at zapatismo to confront the trauma and the pain. And I guess that's maybe my main point, is that as we fight together, we have to learn how to heal together, right? So that we can have that clear vision moving forward. And I think that the pueblos, the CNI, and just indigenous communities that are organized, like TIC as well, have a very strong spiritual practice. It is very common that a lot of the acuerdos, agreements that happen during asambleas, political assemblies, are inspired by what happens during ceremony, right? And so to so many people, this concept and these ideas of connecting spirituality to our process of coming to agreements as a community, it might sound strange, but that's part of, like Roberto says, is kind of deconstructing, decolonizing, doing things differently. And, to move forward by healing, we have clearer vision. And I think that even though we're carrying a lot of anger, and it makes sense and it's completely dignified, it can really cause us to have a blurry vision, often us dividing, finding a lot of divisions within communities, confusing who the oppressor is often, right? Shooting each other down rather than focusing on the true enemy, which is capitalism, which is the civilization of death. So in order to move forward, I think us really confronting the importance of healing and being open to sharing different healing practices without judgment, which brings me to kind of what Roberto was saying, that as we look at the CNI, we learn a lot about, or when we think about what the concept of los pueblos, or maybe in English, it would be the peoples, what that means, who the peoples is, or who are the pueblos, when we think about that in the US context. It's really important to, again, understand that we have to learn how to listen to each other, right? Understanding our very diverse and different calendarios, as the Zapatistas say, calendars, our different geographies, and acknowledging privilege, right? The access that some have to actually have time to organize, or the access that some have to land while others don't. I think the example that I am giving with the art project that Semillas is doing in New York City is a really interesting, because in New York City, like in many urban spaces, we're very limited. It's not as easy to have access to land and to have these conversations about climate change and Mother Earth, and autonomy, when we're in a city that is so, it's the belly of the beast. And migrant communities of color, feel this the most. So us, again, being more creative than the oppressor, and learning from the Zapatistas, who always find space and time and energy for the arts, right? And through that, to be able to talk about what does neoliberalism mean, and having these conversations with the children about what they feel when in the media they see someone like Trump, and they're watching the news or news stories about people in their neighborhood getting arrested, and obviously, like, having those conversations with the families, with their parents being there, is really important. The children actually practice implementing the CNI principles in the way that the story was written around the film, and it's actually the story of the seed, of the semilla. So we were able to, again, kind of like incorporate talking not only about the civilization of death, or what capitalism does to a society, and what colonization does to our bodies and to our communities, but we're also able to honor what the seed teaches us, la semilla, no? La vida, and the cycle, and how we can transmit information, the way that raíces, the way that roots do, and the dance choreography is really, truly the story of the seed. And I think that when we look at what the word of the ECLN and the word of the CNI, there's still more for us to learn about about what it means to, again, to learn from the bottom, desde abajo, not just thinking about the peoples and the pueblos and different struggles, but what the land itself and what el proceso in the cycle of life, the life of a seed, how much that can really teach us to really help us get through that healing and move forward with clearer vision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy. And if you could maybe share a link to the film in the comment section so folks can have access to it, that would be great. And I see some questions coming in, but would like to also remind folks that if who are watching this webinar live, that if you want to, if you have a question you want to pose, please pose them in the comments and it'll get to us. And last but not least, Silvia.
Sorry, I couldn't get the mute. Well, I agree with all of you guys. It's very long to put it all together. I don't want to repeat myself, with all of that. But I just I could add some things that we need to live the present, but not getting we should not forget the past and the history. We should get it at very present, but we should not forget where we're living right now. And also, as Mr. Tisepa says right here in New York, my son is your son and your son is my son. It's a part of that we could continue saying to people, so we could getting more closer to the people by saying, I'm you and you are me, so we are together in this. We are not alone. So none of us, we are alone in the lucha por la vida also. And more than tactics and structures and all that, some words that some people, they don't even understand, but they understand that we need to love ourselves and you need to love the others as yourself. If we could start from there, I think that everything will be more easy in this civilization, because we are looking for the life, and even that everything we have, sometimes it looks for our death, we're still living, we're still here, we are present, and that's all we need to, with all the knowledge and the history, the Zapatistas, Venezuela, or wherever, we have our hand. But it's very simple. I don't complicate myself sometimes. But if we start to doing that as our indigenous people teaching us, with their love the land is loving ourselves too, then we could get up every day and we're still fighting for it. And that's all on my side.
Thank you so much, Silvia. And I'm sorry that you have to leave us early, but thank you for your final words. And I would like to now check in and see if the panelists have any questions for each other before we bring in some questions from the audience. Kiki.
Yeah, I just want to circle back mostly to Ari, just to see if, Ari, you wanted to continue. As you mentioned, you kind of wanted to think about things through a little bit after our contributions, just before we move on.
Yeah, well, I guess I really liked what Daisy had to say about the semilla, and that's really what we work towards. Like, we have an initiative that's called Earthseed, and that really focuses on, like what I already mentioned, the food sovereignty, land sovereignty, and that's really just being able to, as indigenous sovereign peoples, use traditional agricultural ways to take care of each other. And I really also liked what Kiki mentioned about climate change. That's something that we actively work towards addressing, because, you know, a lot of our communities are going to be affected and are already being affected with the communities who are migrating, you know, because of hotter climates and all of that. So I think really just the power is within our communities, even with everything that is already established. We really try to, just with the people that we have, sharing that knowledge. Like, I personally studied environmental science, so I know that a lot of that education is not accessible to a lot of people. So what we do is like community teach-ins, where me and a few other organizers will take all of that education that we learned, and we have classes where we teach each other, we teach our community, and we do that with a lot of theory, like a lot of what you all were talking about. A lot of time that's really hard to understand or to access. And so we like to have community dialogues where we break down theory, we break down everything you all were talking about, right? And we make it accessible so that our community has what they need in order to protect themselves and really survive and thrive. I mean, not survive, I like thrive, because, you know, we've been living in those certain ways for a long time. We have all of those tools to really support each other. And I think that's really what we're working towards right now, having autonomy through indigenous practices that we know and, you know, our grandparents know. So yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to add. Thank you, Kiki.
Thank you so much. Any other comments or questions to each other? Daisy.
I just wanted to add to what Silvia said, that it's definitely true that when we heal, Mother Earth heals, and that when she heals, we heal. And to what compañera Ari just mentioned, you know, really reimagining or being able to transform spaces like we see the Zapatistas do. You can be in a space, and at a certain time of the day it's a clinic, and then it's a classroom, it's a school, it's a this, it's a that. It's like reclaiming and reimagining space and being creative about how we go about that, especially when we don't have much, especially when we're maybe in an urban city or just in general, is really, really important. And being able to not feel like we can't, for example, share or como compartir, in this case, like the knowledge of the story of the life of a seed. Even if you don't have access to land or a garden, there's other ways of doing that. So I just really wanted to emphasize that, because I know it's very difficult for many collectives, for just in general, to find space, and sometimes we feel really limited, and we're in a system that wants us to feel like it's impossible. And then if you've ever been to a caracol, or you go to other rincones zapatistas, or learn of, you know, how other people around the world are implementing autonomy and the Zapatista motto, you realize that it's really not about sometimes a lot of what you think you need, you don't actually need it. It's about the collective. And when you have the collective, and you have that in common, or whatever the objective or the goal is, it's like nothing is impossible.
Thank you, Daisy.
If I could just one observation, I guess, you know, trying to put us all in conversation, right, is that, as Ari pointed out, I mean, the reality is, and it goes back to this question of civilization of death, and how, not how we create another world, but it goes to the point of how other worlds are already existing, right? And the Zapatistas have also said that another world already exists, and it's called pueblos originarios, right? Another world already exists, and it's called First Nations, called the peoples. We exist as such and we already have these deep knowledges, right? So when we think in terms of the civilization of death, in the work of Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, Mexico Profundo, he talks about, in essence, what now we refer to as the civilization of death, but he talks about it in terms of two Mexicos, Mexico Imaginario, or an imaginary Mexico, and a Mexico Profundo. And here Profundo is both profound but deep, right? A deep Mexico, a profound Mexico, which is to say this already existing civilization of what we call ancestral knowledges, of the knowledge of the pueblos that is already there. Now, I would take him to task on the Mexico and would say it's Las Americas Profundas, right? That is not just Mexico and following the nation state lines and all that, but the Americas Profundas, los pueblos are already there. The knowledge is already there. The question is, how do we harness that to first and foremost believe in ourselves for ourselves and trust ourselves with this process of collective building towards autonomy? So just that observation that I had in hearing everyone together.
Thank you, Roberto. So if there's no other questions coming up right now, I can move to a couple folks in the comments are asking about what the Zapatistas or you have to say about the immigrant situation in the US. And one of the questions had a sub-question, which was, and what do you mean by civilization of death? So, I mean, I can, just as a way to get us started, my understanding of the civilization of death is, the capitalist hydra that is, that thrives on the destruction of life and the proliferation of life and the kind of extractivist model of relating to humans and the earth, and that they say the one big no to capitalism and then the many yeses to all other ways of all the other possible worlds that we can inhabit. So, but I would love to know what each of you think, and if you could respond to the question around the specifically as well in terms of the immigrant situation in the US.
Yeah, so in terms of the immigration struggle and what we talked about before about moving past the electoral, all of that mess, I wanted to speak on behalf of my own experience. So I am undocumented, non-DACA indigenous person from Nayarit, Mexico. So with everything going on, it was a big struggle because when the Trump administration began, I was recently in higher education, and that was really hard. And with this new presidency, I had a lot of people saying that, voting would be my salvation, and, DACA is the way to citizenship. But as an indigenous person from not that far away, I'm based in LA, I can literally travel to Mexico. I think it's really important that we think about life beyond just citizenship and, being addressed by this nation state, because I don't know really what citizenship would do for me or my community or any of that, because there still be borders, and my indigeneity would not come before my status, my legal status. And so I really like the question of, where do immigrants stand in this election, especially because, like we had been mentioning before, with climate change, we're going to be seeing a lot more migrants into more northern areas because of the temperatures. The temperatures are going to be very hot. So how do we address migrants within the United States? And I think people need to understand that voting is not going to resolve anything, and neither is DACA. DACA only addresses 5% of the undocumented community, and it doesn't address any of the workers, any of the students who are non-DACA. And so I think that has to be a bigger conversation within itself, especially with the climate crisis, you know, quickly approaching. I think we need to think beyond citizenship and beyond borders and really think about how are we going to address these communities who are most at risk and what we can do to better service them as people and not just as, you know, statistics or however we're addressed. So yeah, that's all I had to say for that.
Thank you, Adi. Would anybody else like to respond to that question, please?
Yeah, I would just briefly add on the question of civilization of death, that I refer to it in terms of understanding not just capitalism, but rather that what we're confronting is a civilizational package of sorts, right? That carries with it, yes, capitalism, but also multiple axes of domination, a particular way of arranging social relations, be it gendered relations, sexual relations, class relations, questions around ability, and also in particular Christianity, religion, right? So we have multiple hierarchies that all operate within this civilizational package. So yes, capitalism's part of it, but it's not capitalism alone. And although we have a tendency to refer to highlight capitalism, the capitalist hydra, I worry that when we only highlight the capitalistic part of it, we lose sight of the fact that capitalism is only possible in the way that it is structured because of the entanglement of these multiple hierarchies of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, language, knowledge, and so on. And so the Christian part of it, as one example, right? It's this cosmological conception of the ability to dominate over the earth, and the earth is created for the sake of humans. That's not a capitalist thing. That has grounded in a very particular cosmological view of the world, which is a particular form of Christianity or Christendom, right? So we need to think about all these things together, because if we don't name it together as a civilizational package, we run the risk of thinking that if we just deal with capital, then we're good and we're done, and everything else will kind of work itself out. So that's why I think it's important to think of coloniality modernity in this way. What, the historical structure that has been put in place, emerging since 1492 to the present, always already trying to totalize or put everything within its fold, though not fully successful, is in fact not just a capitalist system, but a civilization of death, which happens to have a capitalist economy as part of its internal structure, internal working. Because if we say it's capitalism and everything else is a cultural result of that economic system, we're prioritizing capitalism as opposed to recognizing the interrelated workings of all these system forms of domination. So for me, it's important to think of the civilization of death in that way, right? Beyond just simply capitalism, but really about life or death, and not just human life, but as others have already talked about here, the life of the earth itself, of the winged, the creepy crawlers, the four-legged, all the various forms of life that exist on this planet, that this current system has been destroying to a point of possible extinction. And lastly, just to kind of touch briefly on the question of immigration, I would say that when it comes to immigration, part of this civilization of death, or how modernity, coloniality has organized the finca of the world, right? As Moises would say, is that it sets up these divides of nation-state borders. So at the moment at which we accept even the language, the framing of immigrants, we're naturalizing borders. And this is not necessarily a Zapatista point of view per se, but many elders, native elders here in the north, have told us, as people from that come from south of this current border, that the moment you accept that language of immigrant, as opposed to thinking of yourself as indigenous migrants who've been forcibly displaced and are moving across the continent as indigenous peoples have for time immemorial. The moment you accept those borders and call yourselves immigrant, you're already shooting yourself in the foot and starting off on an acceptance of these relatively recent human or man-made borders. And so for that matter, without attributing this to the Zapatistas, because I don't believe they've necessarily spoken to it in this way, I would say that it's important then to undo borders by shifting this discourse around immigrant to migrant, to recognize that somos pueblos, we are pueblos who are migrating sin fronteras, without borders, as opposed to accepting already that type of framing and then working from uneven starting point. Right, we're already starting downstream, working up against a stream, if we already accept that very language of immigrant.
Thank you, Roberto. Would anybody else like to respond? Daisy,
I'll be brief. I just, in regards to the question of the civilization of death, the way that we describe this, especially when we're doing workshops with children and youth, and the way that I really can describe what that means to me personally, really anything that does not build but destroys life, right? And from humanity to our relatives, los árboles, the trees, all forms of life, which is what Roberto was saying. But it's as simple as going back to that principle of construir, no destruir, to build and not destroy. And I think that understanding that is, as simple as it sounds, is really important, because as we reflect on that, we can really question ourselves, right? And how we move in different spaces and what we share, if in whether or not the words that we share are to build or to destroy. Everything we do is an act that's either for life or for death again, and that's what the CNI, the ECLN teaches us. And to the question regarding the migrant communities, kind of adding to what Adi said, it's really not about any political policy that's going to help make this country a safer space for quote unquote migrant peoples. It's about us creating those safe spaces, or again, asking ourselves, are we being active allies? Or are we being passive? Even as POC people, it's quite the privilege to be able to be able to travel back and forth if you have what they call, in Mexicans, papeles, no? And sometimes we absolutely take that for granted, and it's really important to acknowledge our own privilege within our own communities and see how we're supporting spaces that are already that have been created, that are safe spaces, or if we can be a part of creating safe spaces and solutions to be able to overcome a lot of the problems that the migrant community faces. And I'll just end that note with what a quote that Grace Lee Boggs said, we are the leaders that we've been waiting for. And I don't like to use the word leaders, because we know that the Zapatista Zapatistas teach us that it's about collective and not one leader, but it is about us not waiting, obviously, for the state to propose anything that's actually going to truly, or, you know, for us to not have that dependency or be waiting for change to happen. It definitely has to come from within our own communities, and that means that we have to do a lot of reflection of how we are either building or destroying as well, in our connection, in our relationship to capitalism, as well as to the land.
Yeah, on the civilization of death, I'd like to start, if I may be indulged for a couple of moments, just on providing the ability to imagine something else, and before moving on to how capital, and like how Roberto mentioned, even before capital, there is a systemic system that favors death. On farm-based education that we take part of here, that we lead in Southern California, we talk about the example of, like, when we observe plants, and we just finished accompanying a pumpkin patch in September and October, and I really liked the conversations that developed there. What we talked about was how we noticed that when the seed of the pumpkin plant sprouted, there were 2 leaves that came out, and that's very common for all seeds. They have 1 or they have 2 leaves already in the seed. And then as they photosynthesize, then the quote unquote true leaves come out of the plant. And then what happens, if you accompany the plant long enough, you start to see that those first initial leaves from the seed, they wilt and they die. And if you continue accompanying the plant, you start to see it bloom, the squash blossom. And you see that when a pumpkin gets fertilized, the blossom that attracted the pollinators there, it wilts off and the pumpkin starts to grow. And then if you've ever saved seeds, you will see that this is common for plants, that the plant has to die in order for the seeds to be viable. And so then what our reflections are in these kinds of observations and accompaniments with plants is how much wisdom they have in what they teach us about their own cosmovisions or cosmologies or philosophies or spiritualities, whatever we want to call it. That they teach us that the task of life is to continue giving life. So when we die, the question for us, and the Zapatistas and the CNI say this all the time, what is the inheritance that we're going to leave on the planet, on Earth, to continue life going, And then that allows us to consider the question, did those leaves really die? Did that blossom really die? Did that plant really die? And the Zapatistas and the CNI, you know, with the question of martyrs, Samir Flores here, Maestro Teacher Galeano, so many movements, the Palestinian movement has so many martyrs that never die. And of course, we just finished up our Day of the Dead. Again, life continues. And that is a very common philosophy or way of being for so many indigenous cultures all over the world, not just Mesoamerica. And we have a lot of possibilities there. You know, as Roberto mentioned, like, we have a dominant world, but there are other worlds already existing. And so that's what we can learn. And we don't have to travel very far if we can just accompany one plant, a couple of plants, just observe it, observe nature, and allow ourselves to be humble enough to learn these lessons. We see that that philosophy, that world that exists with those plants is favoring life. And that is so distinct from what capitalism does and what the civilization of death does. As Roberto mentioned, there is this cosmology, this way of being in the world, in the dominant society that we're in, that always has to negate difference, has a hierarchy over superiority, inferiority. Every time there is difference, it needs to rank them as such. And this exists well before capitalism. This way of being in the world is how patriarchy is fueled. For example, the domination of Mother Earth is fueled. Capitalism comes in as a very recent system as one that rewards this behavior, where the goal of it is to accumulate profit, which is actually the accumulation of power, and whatever gets in the way, and a lot of things will get in the way, because to accumulate profit, to accumulate power, we need to devalorize so much, not just workers, but Mother Earth, for example. I use the example of, like, you know, when we make paper and pencils, maybe it's workers, maybe it's capitalists that are valued in terms of that labor, but the tree doesn't get asked, you know, about, you know, how much time did you take, tree, to create yourself? And in fact, you can't really ask the tree that, because the tree is not just the tree is the soil microbes and the wind that pollinates the tree and the water. There's so much work that happens in the creation of the world. But under capitalism, it needs to be devalorized in order to be able to extract value for profit. And so capitalism is a reward system for that. And of course, yes, we have to fight against capitalism, but we need to fight against this whole system that understands the world to be that way, that treats us all that way, that is about domination and extraction. Because if we're only fighting capitalism, then what might come after capitalism may be exactly the same with a different face, or it'll have a similar logic. It might just look different. It might be more barbaric, just for more people than it's already been. And I think that this might be where we would be, I think, very well served to start studying if there's actually a really interesting debate happening among a lot of critical thinkers about, are we in a new system? Is capitalism on the decline? Are we seeing something else now that we haven't seen before and we don't have a name for? And so when we talk about migration, for example, in the United States, that question is just discussed as, you know, with the assumption, largely with the assumption that the United States is just a better place to live than the rest of the world is, and everybody wants to come here. And what's not recognized is that people really didn't want to move. People were forced to migrate. There is so much of this happening in Mexico and Central America and down to the South, and the CNI and the Zapatistas talk about this all the time, where what we're seeing is a re-territorialization of the world, where territories that capital was not interested in, capital is now interested in, or this system is now interested in, and it's kicking people out of those territories, and they're having to migrate into becoming proletariat, to becoming workers in the cities. And if they can't find work in their home countries, then they migrate. So this whole systemic vision, I think, is what can help better explain migration and allow us to better understand what is happening at this moment, where we might be in this shift, where maybe capitalism might be on the decline now, with, you know, financialization and speculation and commodity growth. Mother Nature is understood as a commodity now without really much labor in between. And so then workers are becoming transformed out of existence, which is also something Huey Newton predicted back in the 70s. I think in that same essay that Roberto mentioned on intercommunalism, the essay is called Speech at Boston College. It was in November 1970, where workers are being transformed out of existence because of automation. So all of those things there to be able to better have these critical discussions, and they're so needed among all of us, because we only see certain things from our own context. But if we can get to that level of just questioning everything, and also recognizing new realities that may not match up with what we thought would happen, not ignoring those, because those new realities might be pointing to something new happening. And if we miss it, we're not going to be able to struggle effectively against it.
Thank you, Kiki. And Compa Ari has a question to follow up with this line of thinking, which I will pop over to.
Yeah, so a lot of what we've been speaking about is kind of more, it seems like, in the long run, where right now, like Kiki mentioned, we have to worry about the climate crisis and how that's already starting to affect a lot of people. So my question is, in terms of the climate crisis, how, as autonomous and sovereign peoples in the struggle for liberation, do we include the environment, flora and fauna in our movements?
You're muted, Daisy.
Okay, I'm going to assume that I understand your question correctly, Ari, but feel free to correct me or explain further. The indigenous peoples, as far as like when we look at the CNI and when we look at the Greek autonomous movements, are at the forefront of la lucha por la vida, the struggle for life, especially when it comes to climate, the climate crisis and confronting mega projects. It's really important to note that in the first year of Mexico's progressive AMLO administration being in power, there was the highest number of indigenous environmental leaders killed, right? So it's these indigenous peoples that are fighting for autonomy and that are teaching us these principles that we've been talking about, that are also putting their bodies on the line for Mother Earth. But I have to note that this is, again, part of the cosmovision, this indigenous decolonial perspective that's committed to the collective, the survival of the collective and the seeds that you leave behind, kind of to what Kiki was explaining. For example, in the case of Cristina, who was killed, in Colombia, part of the Greek, like Samir Flores, but in the case of Cristina and in the case of indigenous leaders and that are part of the Greek in Colombia and El Cauca, when you are killed and when you die, and they bury your body, it's called a siembra. So you're going back to Mother Earth. And I think that's really important, how they've even have a different kind of perspective of what it means to pass, and that you don't truly die. It's just a siembra. You're just being buried as a seed again, and your life continues. It's also important to note that in the Greek, when you grow up in these autonomous indigenous communities, everyone and every child is considered a guardián del planeta, a guardian of the earth, of Mother Earth. So can you imagine if you are growing up completely looking at the world differently, understanding that you are part of a collective, the collective whole, understanding that your struggle is not based on political parties or identity politics or lines that are drawn on maps, right? But it's for Mother Earth, right? And so I just wanted to mention that. And again, note that it's indigenous peoples who are at the forefront of, climate movement. And so I think that what ends up happening because of censorship is that we end up seeing, I don't even remember her name, the young European girl who was at the UN and who became very famous talking about the climate crisis, and other people who who end up taking up a lot of space when it comes to the climate situation. And again, I think this is all done obviously intentionally by institutions to censor and cover up the reality of it all, is that it is indigenous peoples whose bodies are on the line in this struggle, and I think that's really, really important, that as we learn to acompañar los pueblos, and when we think about what solidarity really means, as Silvia says, that a lot of people seem to have forgotten in Mexico the meaning of solidaridad. When we think of what solidarity means, we have to continue to amplify the voice of the pueblos who are at the forefront of these struggles against mega projects, and then also use our privilege, especially for those who are in the US, especially in New York. We've gone to the headquarters of a lot of these corporations. What ends up happening is when we start to connect the dots, we see it's the same men in black suits making these decisions, who are, invading these communities with these mega projects, mostly from Canada, but it's always the same players that are causing this genocide, because it's really, there's no other way to put it besides this genocide against indigenous peoples, and Mother Earth, obviously.
Thank you, Daisy. We just a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes, and there are a couple more questions from the audience. So if we could keep your responses to this section brief so we can answer at least one other question, that would be super. But Roberto, you look like you wanted to say something.
Oh, you could tell. I mean, I guess just kind of piggybacking on the comments already explained is that I believe it was John Trudell who would say, there's a way to live with the earth and there's a way to not live with the earth, and I choose the way of the earth, and that is to say that we're at war. We're still at war. There is a war on this earth, and those who are land defenders, those who are the pueblos, are really the earth itself fighting for its own survival. We are the earth fighting for our survival. And it's in recognition of that connection, of the unity of all living things and all life forms. Whether it be in the Lakota way that they speak of aho metakuyase, all my relations, and Nahuatl se dice, in Nahuatl it said, Nushtim no mekayotsin, we all come from that same sacred essence. It's a recognition of the unity of all living things. And so the civilization of death aims to, one, compartmentalize things into things, quite literally, that do not have life, are not worthy of life, and hence are to expropriate, to consume, to eat in the form of what Jack Forbes called the wetico disease, a consumption, almost like a cannibal, zombie-like consumption. That sees it only for its own sake and not in relationship with all other life forms. And so I say this because, in part, to kind of move towards some of the other two questions that I saw about the possibility of whether or not there's a possibility of liberation theology. I would welcome those who are interested in liberation theology to look within the history of Christianity at a particular moment where Christianity goes from a Unitarian Christianity that recognized the unity of all life forms to a Trinitarian Christianity. And it's that compartmentalization into the Trinity, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that's really about, a materialization of a logic of domination that happens in the 5th century, where the king of Rome reinterprets the theology of Christianity, which was once a freedom-seeking theology of unity, right? That was Choi, that was Jesus, right? But through this shift to a Trinitarian Christianity, you now have the Father God, Jesus, and the King as a representative on earth that can incarnate that consumption, right? And so liberation theology is definitely an important avenue still, but even more so than liberation theology is that recognition of the distinction between Unitarian versus Trinitarian Christianity. And I think that ultimately brings us back to the question of a way to live with the earth and a way that to live against the earth, and choosing the way of the earth.
Thank you, Roberto. If it's okay with the panelists, I'd like to pose one of the questions from the audience members now, which is, can anyone respond to Subcomandante Moises' Finca Mundial analogy, the global plantation analogy, in the U.S., in the context of the U.S. elections? Kiki.
Yeah, there's a lot of this stems from the analysis that a lot of us were introduced to in the Sixth Declaration in 2005. That, as we mentioned, was the analysis that the Zapatistas came to after having tried to struggle at the taking of the state. That not so much themselves that they wanted to take the state, but they wanted to change the political party that had dominated Mexican politics for 7 decades. they went from critiquing that party to trying to work with other parties and even create another party, to then realizing in that walk that the state has now become something else. The state has now become the administrator of capital. That is, state sovereignty has shifted away from the state, and now we have a global sovereignty with empire, with corporations. And again, Huey Newton, in that essay, speech from Boston College in 1970, that we've now referenced 3 times, was talking about this. The reason why the Black Panthers went from being Black nationalists to Black internationalists and then to intercommunalists was precisely because there could not be room in this world for a sovereign nation, because empire had now become global, and that's what was sovereign. So the analogy of the global plantation in the United States, like so much of the world, the nation state has been taken by global capital, as it's become another one of its plantations, and the politicians are the administrators. And so then the question of, do we struggle for the state? It kind of becomes moot if that's the context. And so then the question of tactical engagement seems to be where we can relate to, if that's actually what's happening. And that's a Zapatista analysis as far as I read it. And so then if that's the case, I think that, going into reading, studying this idea of how then do we organize in an intercommunal way, in a way where it's not bounded by nation state territories, but is actually networked in communities, because global capital is organized in an intercommunal way, just as a reactionary intercommunalism, where they're all taking care of each other in a networked way. So how can we take care of each other from below in a revolutionary intercommunal relations of domination?
Thank you, Kiki. So we just have 3 minutes left, and what I would like to do is just invite each panelist to share in very super briefly, like 30, 40 seconds, some last thoughts that you would like to end with. So I will start with Ari.
So I just want to say thank you to everybody for having me. I really enjoyed listening to what everybody had to say, and I really hope anyone who is watching this, decides to learn more. And I know they're going to be linking a lot of the papers and everything. So I just want everybody to keep learning and keep struggling for liberation.
Thank you, Roberto.
And just to thank you all and everyone viewing from your own trincheras, and all of you for putting this together. Just to end on a note of, the elections, since that was part of the framing of this, and there was a question about the next 4 years. I would just end by saying, I believe Angela Davis said something to the effect of, all this election was about is choosing our next opponent or a better opponent. But we're still at war, and that still remains the case. And we make no presumptions to anything returning back to normal when the normal was already the problem. And we're recognizing that we are at war. We would be all the better to do that as a starting point, to recognize that we're always already going to be seen as violent and in the way of the continued accumulation that this civilization of death thrives on, that the Wetico thrives on. And the sooner we recognize, the better for our own survival, for the own Earth's survival. Gracias.
Thank you, Daisy.
Yes, so I just wanted to remind everyone, one of the most important acuerdos from the Compás de CLN is el acuerdo es vivir, the agreement is to live, is to survive. And I think that as long as we share that, and I do hope that we can continue to find each other through different networks, continue to be grietas, continue to sow solidarity, and continue to learn how to walk together towards building and surviving this war, as Roberto just mentioned. And we can really take advantage of the political stage as these political parties are fighting each other, or lo que sea, however you want to describe the political spectacle going on in the US. Cuba, always says, as far as our global health brigade missions and how we move, it's very invisible. And they say, invisibles venceremos, that sometimes the best work happens when it's invisible within our own networks of solidarity. And I think if we continue to do that, this can be a really strategic time for us to continue to grow autonomy and, again, find each other and enlazarnos as grietas all over the US. And again, thank you for joining us. And I think it was a perfect timing in a way that today is the day of our webinar, even though obviously we didn't know results were going to be shared in the US today. We appreciate everyone tuning in to listen to our palabra.
Gracias, Daisy. Kiki.
Yeah, I'm also very grateful to everyone here and everyone who's listening live and who will also listen after this is recorded. And just final words about, back to, what Ari's question a little bit earlier was about how can we understand our liberation movements, including flora and fauna. And I think that while this is really difficult for me to say and will be difficult for many folks to hear, it's very possible that, very, very possible that we will have a human extinction on the planet. And it's something that, of course, we'd like to struggle against. We want to keep surviving. But one way I think that might be able to help us to get through that possibility, that very real possibility, is recognizing that the flora, the fauna, the microbes, in every animals, plants, fungi, they're all our relatives. And even if we're not here, we need to keep fighting so that there can be life here. This is what makes planet Earth so special, of course, from our point of view as living carbon-based life forms. So just if we really can recognize that, even just that recognition, I think can get us so far, because so much of what's happening with this sixth extinction is that we do not consider other living beings our relatives. Even among Homo sapiens, there are these massive inequalities and devalorizations of who's human and who's not human. So even just that realization, I think, can take us a really long way in building that other world where literally other worlds can fit. And so I just want to thank everybody. I really hope that we can continue the conversation, however it is, whether it's over our Facebook chat, our YouTube chat, our Sexta Grietas webinars. Feel free to reach out to us. We're always trying to find more of us, whether you know about the Zapatista movement, the National Indigenous Congress or not, but you're just curious about how to do politics in a very different way that isn't just keeping us stuck in one way where we have these two horrible choices, then we super, super welcome meeting you and thinking through together, because we're just trying to figure out what to do. We haven't given up on life, and like the CNI says, the defenders of the earth, we're going to be the last one standing. And so let's make sure that there are many, many more of us that are the last ones standing and that we can continue on.
Thank you so much, Kiki, and everybody. You wrapped it up for us all. I just want to thank you all, the panelists, the listeners, the viewers, all the members of Grieta, especially our media team, for making this webinar possible. And Kiki already told you all the ways you can follow us: Instagram, Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, go to our website, reach out, and we hope to see you again soon. And thank you all very much, and good night.
God, go on.